If there was an agreement over Ukraine struck between the US and Russia, Russia could help the US, the wider strategic objective. This is the rationale behind this. It could help the American interests inside Syria by decreasing Iranian influence.
Rebel forces have launched their largest offensive against the Syrian government in years. It's believed that they've taken most of Aleppo and now battling near the city of Hama. What do we know so far about this attack and the group that's leading this?
So the group is an umbrella movement essentially, but the main actor is of course the HTS, the acronym for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. This is a group that was previously affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but broke that relationship around 2016. There was a highly combustible move, created friction within the wider Salafi jihadist movement active in Syria, as well as parts of Iraq. And so the HTS has been the primary actor that has been governing the northwestern province of Idlib, and is known as the sort of rebel, the last remaining rebel stronghold in the country that is, of course, outside of the reach of Assad or state security forces. They launched an attack last week to recapture Aleppo. The territorial borders have been frozen following a sort of fragile but somewhat resilient ceasefire agreement was struck about 4 years ago. And so this offensive, the rebel offensive, came as a shock to many. And the Syrian regime forces appear to have been surprisingly unprepared or unaware that this was coming.
And so why do we think that they were able to conduct this attack? And also why the Syrian government wasn't as prepared?
So there are two main reasons, I would say, as to why the HTS and various other smaller jihadi factions that are moving with them, although the principal actor is the HTS, which is designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States and other countries, that should be noted. And so they will lack the international recognition when it comes to doing the work of the governing when it comes to Aleppo. But that's perhaps a subject matter. In terms of why they were able to be successful, there are a number of reasons. The first is that we need to read what's going on now on the ground inside Syria and the Aleppo offensive against the backdrop of the Israel military campaign against Hezbollah. So Hezbollah fighters previously, both commanders and rank and file soldiers, helped bail out the Syrian regime. They are unable to do that now because they are preoccupied with the fight in Lebanon. The likelihood or risk that the ceasefire, in effect, between Israel and Lebanon over the southern Lebanon and the Hezbollah forces there, the likelihood that that ceasefire could break is a continuing distraction for Hezbollah. And that is their main theater of focus, not Syria at the moment. Another factor, of course, is that this time around, Russia is also otherwise preoccupied in the Ukrainian theater and less willing or able to commit to a higher level of aerial sort of bombardment in Syria to help the Assad regime. There has been, over the past few hours and days, a heightened or escalation in Russian attacks on key rebel targets. But this has been still quite limited relative to previous engagements. And Russian air fire at the moment appears to be mainly targeting civilians up in the northwestern rebel-controlled city of Aleppo. And the purpose of that is to trigger a new wave of refugees that would push against the Turkish border and potentially further afield as well. So create a new crisis. So less willingness for the Russians and the Iranians' ability to engage on behalf of the Syrian regime. And the third factor, I think, is the fact that the Syrian armed forces over the past few years, and I'm talking mainly since 2020, have been relatively weakened, stagnant, becoming less coordinated, less professionalized, fair degree of corruption. And so this has limited the ability of the Syrian armed forces to respond in a meaningful manner. In fact, they retreated as the rebel forces came closer to the city of Aleppo, which is a major city in Syria and highly consequential.
And we heard from the Russian President Putin and the Iranian president that they have unconditional support for the Syrian government. But as you mentioned, they're both preoccupied with their own conflicts. So how do we see this joint response moving forward, and how long can it be sustained?
I think this is not going to be a conflict that we see wind down very soon. I expect the fierce fighting as the Russians ramp up their support of the Syrian state, and what we're looking at right now is the HTS has obtained authority over Aleppo, but the fighting continues to other cities inside Syria, and particularly, I think the epicenter of what will come next is towards the east, the eastern part of Syria, particularly in the area of Deir ez-Zor, which is significant because it has been used for as a main transit route for smuggling activity by Iranian-linked militia into Syria. Again, this takes us back to the wider geopolitical context, the backdrop of Israeli intentions inside Syria, which has clearly been targeting Hezbollah and Iran-linked militia ability to arm Hezbollah inside southern Lebanon as well. So that supply chain and being able to break that supply chain is very important from the Israeli perspective, from the American perspective and interests as well. And Deir ez-Zor is a territory in eastern Syria that is key to that. And I suspect that we will see an escalation in fighting between rebel factions, the government, and Iranian-linked militia there as well. There have been mixed reports coming in over the past 48 hours or so about militia from Iraq crossing into Syria. This has been disputed by Iraqi Prime Minister Soudani and the Popular Mobilization Forces, the main Shia sort of group in Iraq, who clearly are, for the time being, indicating that they would prefer to stay out of this. Iraq is expecting parliamentary national elections in 2025. The political future of Prime Minister Soudani could be hanging in the balance now, depending on the direction of the conflict in Syria and the extent to which he is able to engage inside Syria in this conflict and balance various interests within the political landscape in Iraq. So there are many moving parts right now. Clearly, the epicenter being inside Syria, but neighboring states have a high level of interest as well in what goes on.
Do we see potentially any involvement from the West if things do progress?
In terms of Western interests in the future of this current phase of the conflict, I suspect the main sort of policy concern, security concern, is the potential resurgence of so-called Islamic State or ISIS cells, mainly in central Syria. We have been seeing movement over the past few months to a year, evidence of their reconstitution, rearming. And so this would be the main, I suspect, channel through which Western interests would become mobilized to act. That, as well as the potential risk of another wave of Syrian refugees trapped in the northwest of Syria, particularly if the Russians increase their bombardment of the area, which they have been doing. And so that is worrying. The U.S., of course, supports the mainly Kurdish forces of the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, in the northeast of Syria. And so that's where we also see American interest come into play. The Americans have backed the SDF for a considerable amount of time within the wider framework of the coalition against ISIS. And whilst ISIS has been territorially defeated, undoubtedly, there is the ongoing risk of their potential resurgence. And so this could be an area in which Western interests become sort of galvanized.
And if we look more broadly at the Middle East in relation to Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, for example, if this insurgency holds and progresses in Syria, what does this mean for the Middle East?
Well, when we're talking about Syria, I think the main question for the time being is what this means for the regime itself. Uh, is this the beginning of the end for President Assad? And I think there is much speculation around that, and it's simply too soon to tell, very much depending on the extent to which Russia primarily is able to come to the aid of the regime and to prop up the Syrian army. So that's very much still to be determined, but this is hugely embarrassing for Assad, given that over the past year, the process of normalization with the wider Middle East, the readmission of Syria into the Arab League, and attempts by other states, including some G7 countries, to normalize Syria, the Assad regime, have been ongoing. So, against that backdrop of seeming progress, what we see now in Syria, from the perspective of Damascus, is highly problematic, to say the least. Within the context of the wider the conflicts in the wider Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, the future of the ceasefire. This is a 60-day agreement that will bring us up to January. It is again quite a fragile ceasefire. Many reasons to be cautious about whether it will hold. We've already seen various breaches on a smaller scale, not enough to cross that threshold to declare it to be defunct, but there is concern going forward and what that will mean for Hezbollah inside Syria, Iran's ability to control that supply chain of smuggling routes of arms and weapons into southern Lebanon is in question. It's important to recognize the various moving parts and that the borders are incredibly porous between Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. So there are various many factors that could trigger new hotspots. The conflict, the rebel offensive on Aleppo, for example, this has been brewing for some time. There were rumors back in October that the HTS were ready to take this offensive forward. What held them back was Turkey requested more time or was not in support of the offensive. At that time, Ankara was still in the process of trying to engage with Assad to sit down at the negotiating table to talk about normalization. That did not happen. And I think another point was that the rebel factions in Syria probably didn't want to make it seem as though their offensive on Aleppo, which is a Syrian national issue, they didn't want to make that part of the wider Israeli offensive against Hezbollah. So this came on the back of the ceasefire agreement that was signed that was agreed between Israel and Lebanon.
We have Donald Trump coming into office in January. How do you see him coming into power having any impact on this?
In the Syrian theater, President-elect Trump has made it very clear that he is keen to withdraw the 900 or so U.S. troops that are stationed mainly in northeastern Syria in alignment with the Syrian Democratic Forces. So this is a long-standing issue and questions around the timeline of U.S. withdrawal from Syria, with an ongoing debate happening. The critics of such a move points to sort of the betrayal of the Kurds, which is, again, we saw this brewing in the first Trump administration. But Trump seems keen to take this forward, that if the conflict were to escalate in Syria, as it has done, this would put the lives of American soldiers at risk, and it just isn't worth it from an American national security perspective. So that is significant on the Syrian side. I think when we look then at the Israel-Lebanon, Hezbollah rather, conflict, what we see as a potential flashpoint is the risk that the Trump administration may greenlight or give tacit approval to Israeli settler expansion in the West Bank. And this would clearly derail any hopes of a two-state solution, Palestinian aspirations to self-determination, and could trigger, very likely, another uptick of violence in the West Bank, which is highly concerning for regional stability as well. This could have spillover implications for Jordan, which has long been concerned about increasing Iranian meddling inside Jordan, and West Bank instability could be a strong incentive for Iran to up its role in creating instability in the West Bank, with implications for Jordan as well.
Do you see this having any impact on potential negotiations between Putin and Zelensky? We have Trump saying that he wants to make this deal, but with Russia's involvement in Syria, do we see anything impacting that deal negotiation between the two?
I think the theaters in Ukraine and Syria are linked in ways that we could not have imagined a year or so ago. Trump is very clearly, as you've said, the grand negotiator, the art of the deal, so to speak. So he is clearly going to try to make this happen. And in his mind, and the administration coming in, if the proposed names in his cabinet are actually approved, the more hawkish elements. However, I think there is an incentive to de-escalate, and I suspect that Trump personally wants to be going down in history as having struck a deal with Russia's Putin. If that were to happen in Ukraine, it would have implications for Syria as well. This kind of grand bargain whereby America takes Russia on its side to decrease, perhaps eliminate, Iranian influence in Syria. And that really is key to this. That's what unlocks potential stability in Syria, is the ability to decrease Iranian influence and interference over and access to territory inside Syria. This is an Israeli goal, and the US is very much aligned with it. So if there was an agreement over Ukraine struck between the US and Russia, Russia could help the US, the wider strategic objective. This is the rationale behind this. It could help the American interests inside Syria by decreasing Iranian influence. Russia, of course, has long-standing and ongoing interests in maintaining its own strategic interests inside Syria. It has the naval base in Tartus. It has an air base. Its access to the Mediterranean. Its ability to project power across the region. So Russia has very deeply embedded interests in Syria. Iran will not likewise want to lose its access to Syria, which has been a long-standing ally. So this will be a fierce fight coming up. And for many, I think the Syrian civil war seemed to have fallen off the international agenda. And were surprised last week's rebel offensive to take Aleppo. But the war was a frozen one. And for many Syria watchers, this has been brewing slowly over time. And what we see now, unfortunately, is the eruption of this. Civilians under rebel control in Idlib in the northwest have been trapped there, and very much suffering under Russian and regime-backed attacks against civilians. So this has been sort of a long time coming, and it's important to, within the wider context, for Damascus to engage with the opposition, the political opposition, to hammer out a constitutional process for what comes next in Syria. But we are not there. We're a long way from that, unfortunately.